Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, That Model Railway Guide, for a new tutorial video. Now, in the past I've done videos on how I use servo motors to control the points on my 00 gauge modular layout, but go the tin, which is the 009 layout I've recently been building, I showed you I was using solenoid point motors to move the points. Now, there wasn't really enough time during the layout build episodes to go over exactly how these solenoid motors work, so I'm going to do a more in-depth tutorial today, as I think these are a great option, especially for those building their first layout with motorized points. So, let's get right into it and I'll show you exactly how they work.
So here we are on the workbench, and this is a solenoid point motor. The ones I'm using today are the Gaugemaster SEEP PM2s, and these are the most basic solenoids you can get. There are more advanced versions that allow you to switch the polarity of the frogs and other things too, but for simply moving the point blades back and forth, this is the version we need, and I provided a link to them in the description. Each solenoid has 6 solder tabs, but for this motor we'll only be using 3 of them. On this diagram here, you can see that tabs A and B will bring power from the accessory bus, and then tab C is our common return. This runs back to a switch, usually a toggle switch, and essentially when you flip it in one direction, it makes contact with one of the power feeds. That supplies power to one side of the point motor, activating the solenoid and moving the rod across. To move it back, you just toggle the switch in the opposite direction, and the power is supplied to the other side of the motor instead, causing the rod to move back to its original position. That all seems fairly simple so far, right? So now let's do it in practice. First, we'll solder the wires to the motor itself. To make things easier visually, I'm using different coloured wires here for each feed, which is something I'd recommend you also do as well if you're trying this yourself. Personally, I'm using red and black for the 2 power feeds, and then green for the common. It is a little bit fiddly attaching the wires onto the tabs, especially if you've not done much soldering before. The main thing you need to look out for though is being careful not to get the soldering iron too close to the plastic housing, otherwise you might accidentally melt it. And with all 3 wires now soldered on, let's connect everything up starting from the controller. Now here I'm using a Gaugemaster controller which has a 16 volt AC output for powering these sorts of accessories. You don't have to use this specific controller though, you could just also get a dedicated 16 volt AC power supply for this. I'm then going to take the power from the controller and run this into a capacitor discharge unit. Now, you don't have to use one of these, but I would highly recommend it. Essentially, a capacitor discharge unit, or CDU, stores up energy and releases it in a big burst when the motor is switched. It's a nice, stable and reliable source of power for the point motors, and it will stop them from accidentally getting burnt out too. Additionally, it should also allow you to switch multiple points at a time, so, for example, you could have 2 points controlled from just one switch. Now, to control the solenoid, I'm using this handy bank of switches, although I'll only need to use one switch to control my single motor. You can also use single toggle switches like this, and in fact I have used these in the past on my 00 gauge layout. To wire this up, the positive power feed from the CDU would connect to the inner post on the switch, with the 2 outer wires being the ones we soldered to the A and B tabs on the point motor earlier on. The common from the point motor would then connect into the negative terminal on the CDU. Like I said though, personally I prefer having these little switch banks as I find them a lot easier to use, and it's like having a little lever frame from a signal box. Again, there are links in the description to where you can get these if you want to use them too. To wire this up, the red and black wires from the point motor get screwed into the 2 outer terminals, and then the green common goes into the center one instead. As you can see, adding the CDU into the chain is really easy. The 2 feeds from the controller go to the CDU's input, and then we'll run 2 more feeds from the output to our switches, and that's it. With that done and the power on, let's see if it now works. So I'll flip the switch, and you can see the rod on the point motor snaps over to one side. To return it to the original position, flip the switch in the opposite direction and the rod will move back. Now let me show you how we actually use this in a practical setting on a layout. So, when it comes to adding point motors to a layout, you really want to plan this out before you start laying track. Once you've decided where the points are going to go, mark out where the hole in the tie bar is before you fix the point down. For these 009 points I'm using, and also on N-gauge points too, the hole is at one end of the tie bar and this is where the rod from the point motor will pass through. In comparison, on 00 gauge points, the hole is usually in the centre of the tie bar. With the position marked out, the point should be removed, and then we'll drill a hole through the baseboard for the rod to pass through. And in case you're wondering, this hole is roughly 5 to 6 millimeters across. The point can then be fixed onto the baseboard using whatever method you prefer. For me, I'm using track pins, but as long as it's in exactly the same place as it was earlier, it doesn't really matter what method you use here. With the point now laid, you can see the hole in the tie bar lines up nicely with the opening we've made in the baseboard, and you should be able to see straight through regardless of which position the point is in. The next step, which will make fitting the motor a lot easier, is to take a ruler and draw a line extending out from the tie bar at the same angle on either side. We'll then drill a very small hole through the baseboard at either end of this line, and then when we come to fitting the motor underneath, we can line it up easily rather than it being wonky. Under the baseboard, you may just about be able to see the little holes I drilled a moment ago, and this shows me which way the tie bar is orientated, so I can match this with the solenoid. It's now finally time to fit the point motor in position, and you want to get the rod up through the baseboard and through the hole in the tie bar too, which might take you a few tries. The point motor then has holes on its PCB so that it can be screwed into place. I'll start off by drilling a small pilot hole first. Then the screw can be put into place and tightened up. And with that done for one side, I'll repeat it on the other end of the motor, and then it'll be held in place. Now it's time to solder on the wires, as personally I prefer to do this after I've attached the motor to the underside of the baseboard. So remember from before, the two power feeds go to tab A and tab B. And don't worry about the different colours of the wires that I'm using here. On this particular layout I used red and black for the power feeds to the track, so I decided to use different colours for the points to make this easy to identify. So with the wires soldered onto the solenoid as before, this is the moment at which you would wire up everything at the controller end as we did before. Now back on top of the baseboard, you can see that we have the rod from the solenoid poking up through the point. Obviously this needs to be cut away, and I do this using a Dremel, cutting away the majority of the rod first, and then I grind down any excess that's still poking up. You don't have to use a Dremel though, hard wire cutters also work, and some people like to use a small saw, although personally I wouldn't recommend that as both the points and the motor are quite delicate. Whatever way you do it though, please definitely wear eye protection in case the rod or any little chunks of metal fly off. So, with the motor now installed and assuming you've wired up all your switches, you should now be able to control your points remotely. So, let's give this one a try. And yes, you can see there the point has moved with a satisfying click, so let's go back in the opposite direction. And of course, because we have that CDU in the chain from before, you can see I'm able to operate 2 points at the same time, like here for example at this crossover. So that's pretty much the entire process, and hopefully you have a bit more of an idea on how to add these fairly simple point motors to your own layout. One last thought on wiring. Obviously it can get quite complicated with there being 3 wires running to each motor from the switches. If you have a permanent layout and your switches are all installed in the baseboard, you can easily hide all the wiring underneath. If your control panel is separate though, you may want to use some sort of multi-pin connection instead to save yourself from having to plug in a multitude of wires each time. Now I actually covered that in more detail in my recent 009 series, so go and check that out if that's something you're also considering. For now though, that's it for this tutorial. I hope you found it useful, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe, or alternatively, become a channel member to help support these videos, and you can let me know if you have any ideas for future tutorials too. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!